1,000 miles. Raw copper. One city running a continent's economy. While London held roughly 18,000 people in 1100 AD, a city in present-day Illinois was processing trade goods from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. That city sat where the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers converge the Cahokia Mounds site outside modern St. Louis. You were never taught this, not because the evidence is thin, you were never taught this because the evidence is overwhelming, and that is a different problem entirely. Most Americans learn one sentence about pre-Columbian North America. Small tribes, limited trade, simple economies. That sentence is not a simplification, it is a fabrication. And there is one detail, one specific, documented, isotopically verified detail that dismantles it completely. A copper nugget. Lake Superior. 1,100 miles from where it was found, shaped into the face of a god. That nugget is where this story starts, and where American history, as you were taught, it ends. The site is formally known as Cahokia Mounds, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in southwestern Illinois. We know the general outline: a large, pre-Columbian city, dozens of earthen mounds, population in the tens of thousands. What almost no classroom, textbook, or documentary spends time on is the economic infrastructure underneath that city. Not the mounds themselves, what flowed into and out of them. Raw material moving over distances that should make you reconsider everything you think you know about pre-Columbian America. To understand how remarkable Cahokia's trade network was, you first need to understand what came before it. Not by decades, not by centuries, by 7,000 years. Around 5000 BCE, roughly 3,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids at Giza were built, indigenous peoples of the western Great Lakes Basin were already working copper, not smelting, not casting, something more precise, and, in its own way, more sophisticated. They cold-hammered native copper nuggets, pure, unalloyed metal found in the earth, and then annealed them, heated and hammered, until the metal flowed into shape. This tradition is called the Old Copper Complex, and it represents one of the earliest known metalworking traditions anywhere in the world. 7,000 years, older than written language in most of the world. The people of the Great Lakes were working metal before the Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean had begun. That is not a footnote in American history. That is a lead sentence, one that has never been given to most American students. The old copper complex didn't vanish. It evolved, shifted, and eventually became part of a continental exchange system. A system that, by 1050 CE, had found its center of gravity, Cahokia. Now here is the specific detail this entire video is built around. Not the size of the mounds, not the population numbers, one artifact type, and what it tells us. In Cahokia's workshop, debris excavated from the city's core archaeologists found copper. Not unusual, copper objects appear at dozens of Mississippian sites. What is unusual is what chemical testing of that copper revealed about where it came from. Chemical testing works like a fingerprint. Different copper deposits have different ratios of lead isotopes locked in the ore. You match the artifact's isotope signature to a known deposit, and you know with chemical certainty which mine fed which workshop. The copper processed at Cahokia matched Lake Superior. Lake Superior, present-day Michigan and Wisconsin. Over 1,000 miles from Cahokia's workshops. 1,000 miles is roughly the same distance as driving from New York City to Kansas City, Missouri. Completed not by highway but by canoe and foot, repeatedly, in organized supply runs. 1,000 miles, by canoe. This was not scavenging. This was not opportunistic collection. The volume and regularity of the supply, confirmed by archaeological evidence, indicates a managed, intentional, repeated logistical operation. Someone in Cahokia was coordinating copper extraction at Lake Superior, transport down river systems, and delivery to craftspeople over a distance larger than most European kingdoms of the same era. That is an economy. That is infrastructure. That is political organization capable of managing supply chains across 1,000 miles of continent. The raw copper arrived in Cahokia's workshops as nuggets, some, according to excavation reports, the size of a man's fist. Green-gray, heavy, cold to the touch, even in summer heat. Inside the workshops, craftspeople used stone anvils and the annealing technique inherited from the old copper complex, hammering, heating, hammering again. The copper thinned, flattened, took on shape. 2. And then the craftspeople did something that proves this was never just local production. They made faces. Small copper faces, thumb-sized, technically called long-nosed god maskets, designed to be worn as ear ornaments by elites. These maskets have been recovered at sites from Wisconsin to Florida. Not similar objects, not inspired imitations. Cahokia produced copper faces, distributed across roughly 600 miles of continent. 600 miles in every direction from Cahokia is a circle roughly the diameter of Texas. Inside that circle, Cahokian craftwork appears in elite burials. These objects were not trade goods in the casual sense exchanged at a market for local commodities. They were political instruments. A ruler in present-day Florida, wearing a Cahokia-made copper face on his ear, was making a statement. I am connected to the center of the world. The masket was an alliance marker, a diplomatic credential, a physical object that announced political relationship across a continent. Think of it like this. Cahokia was the Chicago O'Hare of pre-Columbian North America. Not just a city, a hub. Every major continental route converged here. Goods transferred, relationships brokered. The economy of a continent organized through one node. And copper, from Lake Superior, was the premium currency moving through that hub. But copper was only one thread in this network. What comes next, the full map of what was moving through Cahokia, is almost never taught. To understand Cahokia's network, you need to look at a map, not a political map, but a resource map. Draw a line from Lake Superior's copper deposits south to Cahokia, over 1,000 miles. Now draw a line from the Gulf of Mexico north to Cahokia, approximately 700 miles. Now draw a line from the Ozark Highlands of Missouri east to Cahokia, approximately 150 miles. Now add the Appalachian mica sources to the east, the Arkansas novaculite chert quarries to the southwest. You now have a trade network spanning roughly 1,500 miles coast to interior. 1,500 miles is wider than the distance from Los Angeles to Dallas. Each resource moved because Cahokia's craftspeople needed it, and Cahokia's political system could organize its delivery. From the Gulf of Mexico, marine shell, conch and whelk shells, transported 700 miles north, were worked into beads, gorgets, and ceremonial objects. Shell middens refuse piles from workshop processing have been identified at multiple excavation sites within Cahokia's city core. You don't generate a workshop refuse pile from occasional gifts. You generate it from sustained industrial production. From the Ozark Highlands, galena. Galena is a lead-based mineral that produces a brilliant white powder when ground. In Cahokia's ceremonial world, that white pigment had specific ritual significance used in ceremony, applied to objects and bodies. Galena was transported approximately 150 miles from Missouri's Ozark deposits in quantities large enough to classify as organized, repeated supply runs. Not once, not occasionally, consistently, across generations. The texture of raw galena in the hand is surprisingly heavy, denser than it looks, with a metallic gray surface that flakes into brilliant white when ground against stone. That specific material, in that specific quantity, moved 150 miles to supply specific Cahokian workshops. Someone managed that supply chain. And then there was chert Arkansas novaculite, from quarries to the southwest, used for high-quality stone tool production and moving through the same networks. Every single one of these materials required knowledge of where deposits existed, relationships with the peoples who lived near those deposits, and the logistical capacity to move bulk materials over hundreds of miles. Cahokia had all three, simultaneously, sustained across generations. Now here is where the evidence becomes almost impossible to explain away. It was not just raw materials moving into Cahokia. Finished Cahokian goods objects made in Cahokia's workshops were moving out, in predictable, documented directions that map directly onto a continental trade network. Look north, to present-day Wisconsin, a site called Aztalan. Aztalan was a fortified Mississippian settlement, excavated by archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries. Inside Aztalan, archaeologists found Rami-incised pottery, a distinctive ceramic style produced at Cahokia, with specific geometric designs that functioned as a kind of brand. They also found architectural features, the layout of the settlement, that directly parallel Cahokia's design. Aztalan sits approximately 400 miles north of Cahokia. It was not independently inventing Cahokian pottery styles and Cahokian architectural forms. It was a northern trading colony, or an allied settlement embedded in Cahokia's network, positioned to facilitate exchange with Great Lakes copper sources. 400 miles north, right along the route that Lake Superior copper would have traveled south. That is not coincidence. That is infrastructure. Now look southwest, to present-day Oklahoma, a site called Spiro Mounds. Spiro Mounds was excavated beginning in the 1930s controversially, with significant destruction of context, before proper archaeological methods were applied. What survived the excavation included copper plates in Cahokian style and engraved shell gorgets, the same shell gorget tradition that Cahokia produced for elite distribution. Spiro sits approximately 600 miles southwest of Cahokia, in the heart of the Caddoan cultural sphere. Cahokian prestige objects traveling 600 miles into a neighboring cultural tradition means one thing: there was an active, sustained political and economic relationship between these two worlds. Not casual contact, relationship. The Mississippian exchange network that Cahokia anchored was connecting at minimum the Great Lakes copper belt, the Gulf Coast shell fisheries, the Ozark galena deposits, the Appalachian mica sources, and the Arkansas chert quarries. An economic geography spanning 1,500 miles, with Cahokia at its organizational center. And sitting at the heart of all of it, in 1100 CE, was one city. But the most important question about Cahokia's network is not how large it was. The most important question is, what triggered it? What turned a regional center into a continental hub fast enough to register in the archaeological record as a single dramatic event? Archaeologists call it the Big Bang. Beginning approximately 1050 CE, Cahokia underwent a transformation so rapid and so total that it has no clear parallel in North American pre-Columbian history. In what researchers estimate as a single generation, roughly 25 years, the city's monumental core was reorganized on a massive scale. The Grand Plaza was leveled. Mound construction accelerated. The population surged. And simultaneously, this is documented in the material record, the volume of exotic trade goods flooding into workshops spiked sharply. Copper, shell, galena, all appearing in the archaeological record at elevated quantities within the same stratigraphic horizon. Something happened around 1050 CE that triggered a continental economic realignment centered on this one city in the American bottom. Was it a political revolution? A charismatic leader consolidating power? A religious movement that reframed Cahokia as sacred center? The answer is probably all three, operating simultaneously. But the trigger remains the subject of active scholarly debate. What is not debated is the result. Within a generation, Cahokia had become the continent's dominant distribution hub. Goods came in from 1,500 miles away. Finished prestige objects went out 600 miles in every direction. And a single game, spread Cahokia's cultural influence further still. The game was called Chunky. It was played with a precisely ground stone disc, a chunky stone rolled across a prepared clay court, with players throwing spears to land closest to where the disc would stop. The stone discs required significant labor to produce, ground from specific stone types to precise dimensions, smooth and dense. Chunky stones have been recovered from sites in present-day Georgia, Oklahoma, and Minnesota. Not replicas, not locally made approximations. Chunky stones, the specific object that defines this specific game spreading across the Southeast and Midwest. Chunky was not just entertainment, it was social infrastructure. The game created occasions for meeting, for exchange, for the brokering of relationships across cultural boundaries. Imagine an emissary from Cahokia arriving at a regional center 600 miles away. He brings chunky stones. He proposes a game. The game creates an occasion for the conversation that follows. The conversation is about copper. about shell, about alliance. The chunky stone is not the point. The chunky stone is the opening. This is where the evidence stops being merely impressive and starts being revelatory. Because when you map the distribution of chunky stones, long-nosed god maskettes, Ramian-sized pottery, and Spiro-style copper plates simultaneously, you are not looking at isolated artifact distributions. You are looking at a single, coherent, continental network. Every object type follows the same general geography. Every object type clusters at the same regional nodes. The nodes are where the relationships were. The relationships were where the trade was. And at the center of every map, every time, is Cahokia. Timothy Pocketat, the archaeologist who has done more than anyone to document this network, put it this way: Cahokia was not a lonely island of civilization. It was the center of a world. That sentence should be in every American history textbook. It is in almost none. Now comes the part of this story that the network itself cannot tell us the human architecture behind it. Who were the people coordinating this system? What did it feel like from inside? The Osage Nation and the Quapaw Nation, Dagaha language peoples with documented ancestral and cultural connections to the broader Mississippian world, Cahokia anchored carry oral histories that describe exactly this. Large, interconnected communities, long-distance relationships maintained across generations, exchange systems built on kinship and obligation as much as on commodity value. These oral histories are not separate from the archaeological record. They are complementary evidence about the same system. When Osage oral history describes a world of interconnected peoples, maintaining relationships across great distances, that is a description of what the isotopic copper analysis, the artifact distributions, and the Astalan pottery are showing us in material form. Two different types of evidence. One, coherent picture. What that picture shows is not a primitive subsistence economy occasionally exchanging local goods. It shows a managed, politically complex, continentally integrated exchange system operating in 1100 CE, 5 centuries before European contact. The copper at the center of that system had been part of Great Lakes indigenous life for 7,000 years before Cahokia reached its peak. 7,000 years of accumulated knowledge about where the copper was, how to work it, what it meant. Cahokia didn't create that tradition. Cahokia plugged into it and scaled it. That scaling required something that almost no account of Cahokia spends time on: river logistics. The Mississippi River and its tributaries are the reason Cahokia's trade network was possible at its documented scale. The American Bottom, the floodplain where Cahokia was built, sits at the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. That confluence is not incidental to Cahokia's location. It is the reason for Cahokia's location. Place your city at the junction of the continent's 3 largest river systems, and you have placed it at the intersection of every major trade corridor in the interior of North America. Every canoe moving Lake Superior copper south passes through your waterfront. Every canoe moving Gulf Coast shell north passes through your waterfront. Every canoe moving Ozark Galena east passes through your waterfront. Cahokia's founders, or the political leaders who chose and developed this location, understood continental geography with a clarity that rivals any urban planning in world history. They built at the switchboard, and then they ran the switchboard for 250 years. Picture the waterfront at Cahokia in 1100 CE, canoes arriving laden with raw material, the smell of river mud and cedar bark wrapping on the copper bundles, the sound of stone anvils in the workshops beginning their work before the boats are fully unloaded. Craftspeople who knew as their grandparents had known exactly what the copper from the north felt like under a hammer, and exactly how many heats it took to thin it to the thickness a maskette required. This was not improvised production. This was generational expertise, scaled to continental supply. And the objects that left Cahokia's workshops were not raw material resold. They were transformed. Raw copper nugget in. Diplomatic credential out. That transformation, the value added between arrival and departure, is what made Cahokia the center rather than a node. The city wasn't just passing goods along a network. It was the place where goods became something else, where copper became the face of a god, where shell became the gorget that announced elite status, where galena became the white powder that made a ceremony sacred. Manufacturing, transformation, and distribution at continental scale in 1100 CE. But here is the part that the standard Cahokia narrative almost always skips past. This network did not collapse mysteriously, and it was not abandoned without explanation. The decline of Cahokia's network has a documented mechanism, one that took generations to play out and had nothing to do with failure of the civilization's concept. Tree ring data and sediment core analysis, published by Benson, Pawcatutt, and Cook in the journal American Antiquity in 2009, identified a prolonged drought beginning approximately 1150 CE in the American Bottom region. The drought stressed agricultural production in the floodplain that fed the city's large population. Agricultural stress in a large urban center creates cascading effects: reduced surplus, reduced capacity for large-scale distribution, reduced ability to maintain the political relationships that trade networks depend on. Add resource depletion from 2 centuries of intensive agriculture in the American Bottom, and the structural stresses become severe. Add political fragmentation, the kind that tends to follow resource stress in any large, hierarchical political system, and you have a mechanism for decline that requires no mystery at all. Cahokia's population declined significantly after approximately 1300 CE. The network fragmented. The continental distribution system that had organized the movement of copper, shell, galena, and chert across 1,500 miles decentralized. But the peoples of the network did not disappear. When French explorers Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette traveled through the American Bottom in 1673, they found the region populated by Illinois Confederacy peoples, including the Cahokia tribe, direct historical inhabitants of the region, living descendants of the Mississippian world. The Cahokia tribe gave their name to the site, a name that survived into the 21st century on a UNESCO plaque, while most Americans remained unaware of their existence. The Osage Nation, the Quapaw Nation, the Illinois Confederacy peoples. These are not the descendants of a lost civilization. They are the descendants of the center of a world. That distinction matters, not archaeologically, politically, legally, humanly. And calling Cahokia a lost or mysterious civilization erases the living connection between the city and the nations whose ancestors built it. It converts a story of continuity into a story of absence. And the story of absence is easier for certain historical narratives to absorb. An empty continent, or a continent of simple, isolated societies, is a continent available for claiming. A continent organized around a politically complex, continentally integrated civilization, led by peoples whose descendants are still here, is a different kind of place. A place with a history that predates its colonization by thousands of years. A place where the copper in an ear ornament in a Florida burial traveled from Lake Superior through Cahokia's workshops, and where the isotopes in that copper can still be matched to a specific Great Lakes deposit today. Chemistry does not forget, even when curricula do. And here is why that chemistry matters right now, in 2024 and 2025. Ongoing chemical testing of copper artifacts from Cahokia-era sites continues to refine our understanding of exactly which Lake Superior deposits supplied which workshops at which periods. That research does not happen in isolation. It happens in active consultation with Great Lakes tribal nations. Nations whose ancestors worked that copper for 7,000 years before Cahokia's Big Bang, whose knowledge of those deposits is not just historical, but living. The Osage Nation's Cultural Preservation Office has described this ongoing collaboration simply: the land remembers what it gave, and we remember what was made from it. The science and the oral history are sitting at the same table, reading the same copper, asking the same questions. That is not a footnote to the story of Cahokia's trade network. That is the story continuing. The network did not end in 1300 CE. The relationships encoded in it, between peoples, between knowledge, traditions, between the land and the communities who know it, those continued. They continue now. So let's return to that copper nugget. Lake Superior, 1100 CE. A craftsperson in Cahokia's workshop picks it up. It is cold and heavy, green-gray at the surface where oxidation has touched it. Underneath, where a hammer has already struck once, the metal is bright, the color of something freshly made. The craftsperson knows, because someone taught them, who was taught by someone else, in a tradition reaching back 7,000 years, exactly how many heats this nugget needs before it will flow. They know what it will become: a face, a small, specific face, with a long nose that marks it as a divine figure recognizable from Wisconsin to Florida. They know where it is going, roughly. Not the specific burial, the direction, south, to cement an alliance between Cahokia and a regional center whose cooperation the city's political leadership needs. The craftsperson is not making art. They are making a diplomatic instrument from a material that traveled over 1,000 miles to reach their hands, and they are doing it inside a city that is simultaneously receiving Gulf Coast shell from 700 miles south, Ozark galena from 150 miles west, and Appalachian mica from hundreds of miles to the east. All of this happening at once, in one city, in one generation, in 1100 CE. While European historians were recording the First Crusade, while the Song dynasty in China was producing gunpowder weapons, while the Islamic Golden Age was producing algebra and astronomical tables, in the American bottom, Cahokia was running a continental trade network whose chemical fingerprints survived 900 years later in the objects it produced. That is not a civilization operating in isolation. That is a civilization operating at the level of any peer on the planet at the same moment in time. The reason you do not know this, the reason most Americans cannot name Cahokia, let alone describe its copper supply chain, is not a matter of evidence. The evidence has been in peer-reviewed journals, in Smithsonian publications, in Illinois State Archaeological Survey reports for decades. The reason is a curriculum that was built around a particular story about North America before European contact. A story that required the continent to be, essentially, empty of the kind of complexity that complicates the narrative of what European arrival meant. Cahokia, the copper workshops, the Lake Superior supply chain, the long-nosed god maskettes traveling 600 miles, the chunky stones in Georgia and Minnesota, Aztalan as a northern trading colony, Spiro as a southwestern corridor, all of it complicates that narrative. Profoundly, irrecoverably. If you let it. The question this leaves you with is not about Cahokia specifically. If a 1,500-mile trade network can sit in published scholarship for decades, while most classrooms ignore it, what other systems, what other civilizations, what other ingenuity is waiting in the same journals? The copper nugget arrived at Cahokia's waterfront over 1,000 miles from where it was extracted. It left Cahokia's workshop as the face of a god, worn by a ruler 700 miles away. The isotopes in its metal still match Lake Superior today, 900 years after the workshop went quiet, 900 years after the craftsperson who shaped it is gone. The sources for everything covered here are in the description. Pawcatat's Cahokia monograph, Emerson and Lewis's Cahokia and the Hinterlands, and the Benson, Pawcatat, and Cook Climate Study in American Antiquity. Primary sources, peer-reviewed, read them. The Osage Nation and Quapaw Nation maintain websites and cultural education resources that document their connections to the Mississippian world in their own terms and their own voice. Those resources are also linked in the description. The copper never forgot where it came from.